Today we will talk about the international monetary system. The international monetary system, which governs exchange rates, is central to understanding currency values. In a floating exchange rate system, major currencies like the U.S. dollar, euro, yen, and British pound fluctuate based on market supply and demand. However, many developing countries peg their currencies to a reference currency, such as the dollar or euro, fixing their exchange rates relative to these benchmarks. Some countries employ a dirty float, allowing their currency to float within a controlled range, intervening to prevent rapid depreciation. China, for instance, manages its currency against a basket of currencies. Lastly, fixed exchange rate systems where currencies are held at agreed rates were historically used, notably within the European monetary system pre-1999. Though the fixed rate system largely ended in 1973, there is ongoing debate about its potential re-establishment. This chapter explores the international monetary system and its impact on global business. It starts by tracing the system's evolution, beginning with the gold standard's collapse in the 1930s and the establishment of the Bretton Woods system in 1944. The Bretton Woods system set fixed exchange rates against the U.S. dollar and created the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank, institutions that continue to play key roles in global finance. The IMF aims to stabilize international monetary systems, while the World Bank promotes development. Notably, the IMF has been involved in major financial crises, such as the Asian financial crisis, 1997, and crises in Greece and Ireland, 2010. But its policies remain controversial, especially in developing nations. Since the Bretton Woods system ended in 1973, a mixed exchange rate regime has emerged, where some currencies float freely, while others are managed or pegged. The debate over the best exchange rate regime persists, with some advocating for floating rates and others for a return to fixed rates. The chapter will discuss both views, as well as the implications of these systems for international business, focusing on how exchange rate policies and IMF interventions affect economic conditions and business decisions in different countries. The gold standard began with gold coins as currency, making trade payments with gold or silver. However, as trade expanded after the Industrial Revolution, shipping gold became impractical, leading to paper currency backed by gold at a fixed rate. Under this system, called the gold standard, countries pegged their currencies to gold and guaranteed their convertibility. By 1880, many major economies, including the U.S., Britain, Germany, and Japan, had adopted the gold standard, simplifying currency exchange rates. For instance, one U.S. dollar was equivalent to 23.22 grains of gold, making an ounce of gold worth $20.67. The British pound was equivalent to 113 grains, so 1 ounce of gold cost £4.25, setting the exchange rate between the pound and the dollar at £1 equal $4.87. The main advantage of the gold standard was its mechanism for achieving balance of trade equilibrium. A country reaches this equilibrium when income from exports equals the money paid for imports. For instance, if Japan had a trade surplus with the U.S., Japanese exporters would receive U.S. dollars, exchange them for yen, and Japan would demand gold from the U.S. in return. This flow of gold would reduce the U.S. money supply and increase Japan's, causing U.S. prices to drop and Japanese prices to rise. As a result, U.S. goods would become cheaper, increasing demand, while Japanese goods would become more expensive, reducing demand. This automatic adjustment would eventually balance trade between the countries. Despite the gold standard's collapse, some still support its simplicity and stabilizing effects. The gold standard operated effectively from the 1870s until World War I, when it was suspended as countries printed money to fund military expenses, leading to widespread inflation. After the war, the U.S. rejoined the gold standard in 1919, Britain in 1925, and France in 1928. However, Britain pegged the pound to gold at its pre-war value despite significant inflation, making British goods costly abroad and deepening its depression. As confidence in the pound waned, Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931. The U.S. left the gold standard in 1933, rejoining in 1934 with a new gold price of $35 per ounce, devaluing the dollar. This devaluation aimed to boost U.S. exports by lowering their prices, but other countries also devalued their currencies, triggering competitive devaluations. This undermined trust in the gold standard as currencies' values became unpredictable. By World War II's start in 1939, the gold standard had collapsed. In 1944, representatives from 44 countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to create a new international monetary system to foster post-war economic growth. Remembering the gold standard's collapse and the competitive devaluations of the 1930s, they agreed on a system of fixed exchange rates that would avoid these issues. To enforce this, they established the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to maintain monetary order, and the World Bank to promote economic development. Under the Bretton Woods system, countries pegged their currencies to the U.S. dollar, which remained convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Each country set its exchange rate against the dollar and pledged to keep it within 1% of the set value by intervening in currency markets as needed. The agreement discouraged competitive devaluation, although a controlled devaluation of up to 10% was allowed without IMF approval for weak currencies, with larger adjustments requiring IMF consent. The IMF's Articles of Agreement, shaped by the economic turmoil of the interwar period, aimed to prevent similar chaos through discipline and flexibility in the international monetary system. Discipline. The fixed exchange rate system was designed to curb competitive devaluations and promote monetary stability. By requiring countries to maintain fixed exchange rates, it imposed economic discipline, controlling inflation by limiting excessive money supply growth. For example, if Britain printed more pounds, leading to inflation, its goods would become less competitive, widening its trade deficit. Under a fixed regime, Britain would have to reduce money supply growth to stabilize its economy. Flexibility. Recognizing that strict fixed exchange rates could cause recession and unemployment, the IMF built in flexibility through lending facilities and adjustable parities. IMF lending helped countries in short-term deficits avoid harsh monetary tightening that could harm employment. The adjustable parity system allowed countries to devalue their currency by over 10% if experiencing a fundamental disequilibrium, though undefined, to address long-term adverse shifts in demand. These features aim to create a balanced system of discipline and adaptability, promoting stability without rigid constraints. The World Bank, officially known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, was initially focused on financing the post-war reconstruction of Europe. However, with the overshadowing of its role by the Marshall Plan, the World Bank shifted its focus to development, providing low-interest loans to Third World nations. In the 1950s, the bank emphasized public sector projects like power stations and transportation infrastructure, while the 1960s saw increased lending for agriculture, education, population control, and urban development. The World Bank operates through two main schemes: the IBRD, which raises funds through bond sales in international markets, offering low-interest loans to countries with poor credit ratings, and the International Development Association, IDA, established in 1960, which provides resources from wealthy members to offer interest-free loans and grants to the poorest nations. IDA loans have a repayment period of 50 years at a nominal interest rate of 1% annually, supporting the development needs of the world's most impoverished countries. The Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system functioned well until the late 1960s, when it began to falter due to pressure on the U.S. dollar, which was central to the system as the only currency convertible into gold. Rising U.S. inflation and a deteriorating trade balance, spurred by increased spending on the Vietnam War and welfare programs under President Johnson, led to concerns that the dollar would be devalued. By 1971, the U.S. trade balance shifted into deficit, sparking speculation and massive buying of stronger currencies like the German Deutschmark, which led to a floating of the mark and a broader crisis. In response, President Nixon suspended dollar convertibility into gold in August 1971 and imposed a 10% import tax to push other countries to revalue their currencies. This led to an 8% devaluation of the dollar by December 1971. But persistent inflation and a worsening balance of payments deficit kept speculative pressure on the dollar. By March 1973, European central banks ceased efforts to stabilize the dollar, and key currencies began floating, marking the end of the fixed exchange rate system. The Bretton Woods system's reliance on the dollar's stability was its downfall. It could not sustain itself when the U.S. faced inflation and trade imbalances. The shift to a managed float system, intended as a temporary fix, became permanent as the fixed-rate system proved unworkable under speculative strain on the dollar. The Jamaica Agreement, formalized in January 1976, established the modern framework for a floating exchange rate system under the IMF. Key provisions included acceptance of floating exchange rates, with IMF members allowed to intervene in the market to reduce unwarranted speculative fluctuations. Removal of gold as a reserve asset, with the IMF returning gold reserves to member nations and creating a trust fund for poor countries. An increase in IMF quotas from $41 billion to $767 billion, along with expanded membership to 187 countries, and improved access to funds for non-oil exporting, less developed nations. This agreement marked a significant shift to flexibility in the international monetary system. Since March 1973, exchange rates have become more volatile due to unforeseen shocks like the oil crises in 1971 and 1979, the loss of confidence in the dollar in 1977 to 1978, the rise and fall of the dollar between 1980 and 1985, the collapse of the European monetary system in 1992, the 1997 Asian currency crisis, and the decline in the value of the U.S. dollar from 2001 to 2009. The value of the dollar has fluctuated significantly against major trading currencies. Factors such as capital inflows, real interest rates, political turmoil, and trade deficits have influenced these fluctuations. Government intervention and market forces have played a significant role in determining the value of the dollar. Interventions like the Plaza Accord in 1985 and the Louvre Accord in 1987 aim to stabilize exchange rates. The dollar's value has been influenced by factors like foreign investment in U.S. financial assets, trade deficits, budget deficits, and government policies. The dollar's value has been subject to fluctuations, influenced by market dynamics and government actions in what is sometimes referred to as a managed float or dirty float system. The debate between fixed and floating exchange rate regimes continues since the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, with renewed interest in fixed rates due to dissatisfaction with floating rates. The case for floating exchange rates includes two main arguments. Monetary policy autonomy. A floating exchange rate allows governments to control their money supply without being restricted by the need to maintain exchange rate parity. Under a fixed system, expanding the money supply or adjusting interest rates could disrupt the exchange rate, limiting monetary policy. In a floating system, governments can adjust their economy, e.g., increase money supply to reduce unemployment, without worrying about maintaining a fixed rate. Currency depreciation can offset inflation, maintaining international competitiveness. Automatic trade balance adjustments. Under a floating system, a country with a trade deficit will see its currency depreciate as demand for its currency decreases. This depreciation makes exports cheaper and imports more expensive, helping to correct the trade imbalance. This is seen as a more natural and efficient adjustment mechanism than the fixed system, which required IMF intervention and devaluation. These factors make floating exchange rates appealing, although many still debate their effectiveness in practice. The case for fixed exchange rates is based on several arguments. Monetary discipline. Fixed exchange rates force governments to maintain stable monetary policies, preventing excessive inflation caused by political pressures to expand the money supply. This contrasts with floating rates, where governments have more freedom to control inflation, but may overexpand the money supply, leading to instability. Speculation. Critics of floating rates argue that speculative trading can cause exchange rates to fluctuate unpredictably. Speculators may sell currencies in anticipation of depreciation, causing a self-fulfilling cycle of volatility. A fixed exchange rate system is seen as a way to limit the damaging effects of such speculation. Uncertainty. Floating exchange rates introduce unpredictability, making it difficult for businesses to plan and manage risks in international trade and investment. This uncertainty can hinder global trade growth. Supporters of fixed rates argue that stability in exchange rates would reduce uncertainty and promote international trade and investment. These arguments suggest that fixed exchange rates can provide more stability and predictability than floating rates, fostering economic growth. However, proponents of floating rates counter these points, especially by noting the availability of forward exchange markets to manage exchange rate risks. Supporters of floating exchange rates argue that they help adjust trade imbalances by allowing currencies to depreciate or appreciate based on supply and demand, thus correcting trade deficits. However, critics question the link between exchange rates and trade balances, arguing that trade deficits are more influenced by the savings-investment balance in a country than by currency values. They also claim that currency depreciation leads to inflation, which can neutralize any advantages gained from improved cost competitiveness. For example, despite a 40% drop in the U.S. dollar between 1985 and 1988, the trade deficit did not improve. However, advocates of floating rates point to a reduction in the U.S. trade deficit between 1985 and 1992, partly attributed to the dollar's depreciation. The debate on whether fixed or floating exchange rates are more beneficial remains unresolved. While fixed exchange rate systems like Bretton Woods ultimately failed due to speculation, proponents suggest that a new kind of fixed system could potentially offer more stability, promoting international trade and investment. The effectiveness of either system remains a point of contention, with no clear consensus on which is superior for international business. Governments adopt various exchange rate policies, ranging from free floating exchange rates, where market forces determine the value of a currency, to more fixed systems like a pegged exchange rate. According to IMF data, 14% of member countries allow their currencies to float freely. 26% use a managed float, limited intervention, and 22% have adopted foreign currencies, E.G., U.S. dollar or euro, as legal tender. The remaining countries use more inflexible systems, including fixed peg arrangements, 28%, or adjustable peg systems with target zones for currency fluctuation. Under a pegged exchange rate, a country ties its currency's value to a major currency, such as the U.S. dollar. This system is often favored by smaller nations as it imposes monetary discipline and keeps inflation low. For example, if Belize pegs its currency to the U.S. dollar, it must maintain similar inflation rates to avoid devaluation. Pegged exchange rates tend to result in lower inflation rates, as studies show that countries with pegged systems have an average inflation rate of 8%, compared to 14% for intermediate regimes and 16% for floating regimes. However, maintaining the peg can be challenging, especially for smaller countries facing capital outflows or currency speculation. The 1997 Asian financial crisis exemplifies how countries like Thailand and Malaysia were forced to abandon their pegs due to economic issues like excessive debt and trade deficits. During the 1997 Asian currency crisis, Hong Kong successfully maintained its currency peg to the U.S. dollar at around HK $7.80, equal $1 despite multiple speculative attacks. This success is attributed to Hong Kong's currency board system, which requires the domestic currency to be fully backed by foreign currency reserves, in this case the U.S. dollar, at the fixed exchange rate. The currency board system limits the government's ability to print money, preventing inflationary pressures. If investors exchange local currency for foreign currency, interest rates automatically rise to restore demand for the local currency, as seen when Hong Kong's interest rate soared to 20% in late 1997. The Hong Kong Currency Board has been in place since 1983 and has weathered several crises. This success led other developing countries, including Argentina, Bulgaria, Estonia, and Lithuania to adopt similar systems. However, currency boards have drawbacks. If local inflation rates exceed those of the pegged currency's country, the domestic currency can become uncompetitive and overvalued, as happened in Argentina. Additionally, governments under currency boards cannot set their own interest rates, as rates are effectively determined by the country of the pegged currency, like the U.S. Federal Reserve for Hong Kong. The economic collapse in Argentina in 2001 and its decision to abandon the currency board dampened enthusiasm for this exchange rate management system. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1973 was initially expected to diminish the IMF's role. However, the IMF has expanded its activities significantly over the past 3 decades. Initially, the IMF's primary function was to provide short-term loans to countries facing balance of payments issues. With the adoption of floating exchange rates, it was believed that this demand would decrease. However, periodic financial crises, particularly in the 1990s and 2008, have led to increased demand for IMF assistance. The IMF has provided substantial financial support to countries like South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, Turkey, Russia, Argentina, Brazil, Latvia, Greece, and Ireland during times of economic turmoil. To address the growing financial crisis in 2009, the IMF tripled its resources to $750 billion. While the IMF has played a crucial role in stabilizing economies, it has also faced criticism for the conditions attached to its loans. Some argue that these conditions, often involving austerity measures, can exacerbate economic hardship. The debate over the IMF's role and its impact on recipient countries continues to be a subject of discussion. Over the past 30 years, various financial crises have necessitated International Monetary Fund (IMF) intervention, including currency, banking, and foreign debt crises. A currency crisis occurs when speculative attacks lead to significant depreciation or the depletion of international reserves, as seen in Brazil in 2002. Banking crises arise from a loss of confidence, prompting withdrawals and bank runs, while foreign debt crises occur when countries struggle to meet debt obligations, exemplified by Greece and Ireland in 2010. Common causes of these crises include high inflation, widening current account deficits, excessive domestic borrowing, and asset price inflation. Notable crises include the 1995 Mexican peso crisis and the 1997 Asian financial crisis, both driven by excessive foreign borrowing, weak banking systems, and high inflation. The Mexican crisis led to a significant IMF bailout, while the Asian crisis required extensive IMF loans to stabilize economies in Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea, each grappling with severe currency devaluations and economic turmoil triggered by unsustainable investment and debt levels. By 2010, the IMF was providing loans to 68 countries facing economic or currency crises, with conditions that often included tight macroeconomic policies such as spending cuts, higher interest rates, and deregulation. Critics argue that these one-size-fits-all policies are inappropriate for nations experiencing private sector debt crises, as seen in South Korea, where the IMF's requirements for maintaining inflation led to higher interest rates that exacerbated corporate defaults. Additionally, the IMF's interventions raise concerns about moral hazard, as they may encourage reckless behavior by banks, knowing they will be bailed out. Critics also highlight the lack of accountability within the IMF, suggesting that its small staff lacks the necessary expertise to effectively manage complex economic situations. Economist Jeffrey Sachs advocates for reforms to increase the IMF's reliance on external expertise and improve transparency. The debate over the appropriateness of IMF policies remains complex and unresolved. Critics point to the limited success of IMF interventions, such as Turkey's repetitive engagement with 18 IMF programs since 1958. However, defenders highlight the IMF's role in containing the Asian financial crisis and managing the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2010, where it successfully supported countries like Iceland, Ireland, Greece, and Latvia. The IMF is credited with effectively navigating politically sensitive situations, such as the Mexican peso crisis, and promoting free market reforms. While some countries have faced ongoing challenges, the IMF cannot compel governments to implement necessary policy changes, often leaving it in a difficult position where withholding funds could lead to financial collapse. Notably, in response to recent crises, the IMF has begun advocating for fiscal stimulus and monetary easing, a shift from its traditional stance. This newfound flexibility suggests that the IMF is adapting its strategies to better address the root causes of economic crises, such as excessive debt, rather than solely focusing on controlling inflation. The implications for international businesses from the discussed material focus on three key areas: currency management, business strategy, and corporate government relations. In terms of currency management, companies must adapt to a mixed foreign exchange system influenced by government intervention and speculation, leading to volatility that increases foreign exchange risk. Utilizing financial instruments like forwards and swaps can help mitigate this risk. Regarding business strategy, the unpredictable nature of exchange rates necessitates maintaining strategic flexibility, such as diversifying production locations and potentially contracting out manufacturing to reduce economic exposure. High value-added manufacturing may require more careful consideration due to switching costs. Finally, in corporate government relations, businesses can influence government policies on the international monetary system, advocating for stability to foster trade and investment. This is particularly important given the detrimental effects of exchange rate volatility experienced in past decades. Overall, businesses must navigate these complexities to remain competitive in the global marketplace.
Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe to channel.